Dear distinguished guests, colleagues, students, welcome to the second William J. Perry Lecture held in conjunction with IWA Graduate School of International Studies Distinguished Global Lecture Series. The William J. Perry Lecture Series is supported by the Pacific Century Institute, and we're honored to be joined by its co-founder, Spencer Kim, Chairman and CEO of CBOL Corporation, and also this time we have the President of the Pacific Century Institute, Ambassador Raymond Burkhart, who has joined us with some journalists from the United States. Our speaker today is Kathleen Stevens, President and CEO of the Korea Economic Institute of America, former Korea diplomat, and formerly the United States Ambassador to South Korea from 2008 to 2011. As such, she's eminently qualified to share with us her wisdom on gender politics and diplomacy, American and Korean perspectives. I'm sure that Ambassador Stevens' insights will be particularly welcomed by our students, who will be the women leaders of tomorrow. IWA President and former Graduate School of International Studies Dean, Eun-mi Kim, will speak further to Ambassador Stevens' eminent achievements next. The lecture and in-depth discussion will be moderated by Professor Ji-ae Som, invited professor at IWA GSIS and senior communications consultant for the Korean Green Growth Trust Fund. We will, of course, welcome questions from our audience in the final section of today's proceedings. So I'll now hand over to President Eun-mi Kim for her welcoming remarks.
Good afternoon. Her Excellency Kathleen Stevens, Mr. Spencer Kim, President Raymond Burkhart, distinguished guests and students, professors, staff, and alumni of IWA Women's University, welcome to the William J. Perry Lecture Series. We are honored to host the William J. Perry Lecture Series at IWA Women's University, co-organized by the Pacific Century Institute and the Graduate School of International Studies here at IWA. I would like to thank the Pacific Century Institute for their generous sponsorship, and Dean Brendan Howe, Professor Ji-ae Som, and the staff of GSIS for preparing today's lecture. Maybe we should give them a small round of applause. The William J. Perry Lecture Series began in 2016, named after William James Perry, former Secretary of Defense of the United States. It brings outstanding professionals in various fields who have answered their country's call to government service. The globally renowned speakers have shared their experience in government and provided insights on global challenges and leadership. The Pacific Century Institute, a nonprofit organization based in Los Angeles, focuses on building bridges between countries and people and has generously sponsored this lecture series to support cross-cultural dialogue and nurture future leaders. I'm particularly grateful to Mr. Spencer Kim, co-founder of the Pacific Century Institute, and President Raymond Burkhart for bringing the William J. Perry Lecture Series to IWA to inspire future leaders, and in particular women, who aspire to serve their nation and the world. Last year, we had the honor of hosting the first William J. Perry Lecture Series with Ms. Janet Napolitano, the former U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security. Her speech motivated our students to always think outside the box and dream to serve those in need. I would like to take this opportunity for the generous scholarship provided to students from developing countries studying at IWA GSIS, which has been named the Janet Napolitano Scholarship. Thank you, Mr. Spencer Kim, the Pacific Century Institute, and Ms. Napolitano for this great opportunity. Without further ado, let me introduce today's distinguished speaker of the William J. Perry Lecture Series, Her Excellency, former Ambassador Kathleen Stevens of the United States, who served as the first Korean-speaking U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Korea from 2008 to 2011. She has been a career diplomat from 1978 to 2015 and served in various capacities and countries. One of her notable achievements was as the U.S. Consul General in Belfast, Northern Ireland, where she served during the negotiations culminating in the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. In addition to several postings in the Republic of Korea, she has served in China, former Yugoslavia, Portugal, and India. She has also served in Washington, D.C. in the Department of State and the White House. She is currently the president and CEO of the Korea Economic Institute of America. She chairs the board of the Korea Society and is vice chair of the board of trustees of the Asia Foundation, and I just learned the chair of the Pacific Century Institute. However, she is most fondly remembered throughout the Republic of Korea as the Young Peace Corps volunteer in Yesan from 1975 to 1977 with the name Shim Eun-kyung. Did you know that? And also, when serving as ambassador, she was seen in formal occasions, but also riding her bike throughout the countryside, mingling with Koreans in the open market, parks, and on the road, and sharing her love of everything Korean. It wasn't just that she spoke Korean that was noble, but it was her genuine appreciation, respect, and care that she gave to the distinguished as well as ordinary everyday Koreans she would meet. Her Excellency Ambassador Stevens is an outstanding diplomat who served with respect and knew no bounds in the field she would traverse. You will find that her enthusiasm, energy, and smile are simply contagious. In recognition of her outstanding career in political and diplomatic fields, we are honored to invite Her Excellency Ambassador Kathleen Stevens to deliver the speech entitled Gender in Politics and Diplomacy, American and Korean Perspectives. Her insights on women leadership and gender will inspire IWA students who aspire to become global leaders. Now, please help me welcome Her Excellency Ambassador Kathleen Stevens to the podium with a warm round of applause. Kathy.
Well, hello, everyone. Anishpika. President Kim and me, thank you so much for that introduction. I feel very awkward standing before you after such a generous introduction, which I can't possibly live up to. But I can say it is always a pleasure to be back in Korea, but a very, very special pleasure to be back at Ewha Women's University and to see so many friends here, old and new. I was saying to someone earlier, I think I have all of my old friends here, as well as maybe some of you who are required to come for class. But wherever you, it's really great to see all of you here, as well as our group of journalists, of American journalists from the United States that I had the pleasure of traveling with today from Jeju-do. We just flew up from Jeju, who are here. Many of them, I think, or most of them in Korea for the first time. When we this title, I gave this title for this lecture, but it actually makes me nervous when I look at it. And I hope that whatever insights we have, especially on Korean perspectives, are going to come from my great friend Song Ji-ae when we have a conversation later, and all of you. And I know this is a very, very international group, but all here at Ewha, I think, share an interest in exploring this topic, and I really am looking forward to it. So I have to get through my remarks first so we can have that conversation. And I'm really looking forward to it. But I do, again, want to thank President Kim, whom I've gotten to know over the last several years. In particular, I admire so much her work here. She just kind of updated me on some of the incredible things going on at Ewha Women's University. It's no surprise to me, except it's just always a source of inspiration to see how Ewha is always moving forward, looking forward, and addressing the challenges of today. I'm very grateful to Pacific Century Institute for having the Perry Lecture, for inviting me to be one of the lecturers. I have a friend, a colleague, who was actually emailed me from California just a few days ago. He was in Monterey, California. Secretary Perry is 95 years old. He's still at Stanford. And in Monterey, just a few days ago, he gave a speech on, get it, the evolution of war. So at 95 years old, he's still bringing his wisdom, his experience to all of us, and it is a deep honor to give a lecture here at IWA named after him. While I'm talking about all the things in this throat clearing that make me a little nervous, I've given a lot of speeches, but a little nervous about this one is that, but also inspires me, is the fact that last year's speaker was Janet Napolitano. I actually have never met her in person, although we share the same home state of Arizona. I grew up there, we're of the same generation, and I've always so admired her that I was very interested in seeing what she would have to say, and I'm very glad that her lecture is available on YouTube. If you haven't watched it, your homework from this lecture is watch that lecture. She said many things that I would like to say far better than I could say them about her own incredible career, incredible journey in life, all the things that she did. And growing up in Arizona myself, I know it wasn't easy, especially to be elected governor. I mean, we're going to talk about politics here, but I say that as someone who, yes, was in public service, I never had the bravery, or maybe some would say the foolishness, but I'd say the courage to put myself before the people for a vote. She did that in Arizona multiple times, and I respect her always for that, as well as for the incredible public service that she continued to give in a variety of posts. But one thing she said, I'm going to start kind of quoting her, when she talked about and gave, I think, a lot of hints for all of us at whatever stage we are in our careers, whether we're male or female, about public service, about leadership. But she said of the same generation, of the same mind, she kind of avoided being identified as a woman leader. And she told a story about when she announced that she was going to run for governor of Arizona, and a journalist asked her, are you running for governor as a woman? And she said, well, I really don't think I have much choice. But she said, but she didn't concentrate on that. She felt like she didn't want to muse about gender. She wanted to get the job done right. She wanted to be the best governor she could. And I think that's very typical of maybe of all of us, but certainly of my generation, that I didn't want when I came to Korea as ambassador, and I was mindful of the fact that there had not been a woman serving here as ambassador before. Although I appreciate President Kim emphasizing that I was the first Korean-speaking ambassador, and I don't speak Korean very well, but but a little bit goes a long way. And I found throughout my career, but I didn't want to be the woman ambassador. I wanted to be the best possible American ambassador to a country with which we have such deep ties, such a complicated relationship, and such an important future. But I also realized, coming here as a woman, that I could play a role, if I could just do a good job, to encourage others, both men and women, people who might not have thought about themselves in a position where they hadn't seen someone who looked like me before. And that was a very inspiring thing for me and a great lesson for me. And I do think, I'm actually going to quote someone else, not by name, but a woman I knew was in former Yugoslavia for a while, who's a war photographer, another field that didn't attract a lot of women back in the day. And she said, pretty tough area. And I remember her saying to me once, of course we want equality, but we also bring something different. We go through life differently in the skin that we're in. And she brought that to her war photography. And I feel like we all have to bring that to the jobs we have. And whether consciously or unconsciously, at times, a little bit of both. I guess I tried to do that in my diplomatic career, and certainly tried to do it as ambassador to Korea. So I guess you'd expect from someone like me, because I've kind of been around for a long time now, and in Korea, have a long history in Korea, as was mentioned, that I would say the kind of cliche of course, there's been enormous change in Korea over the years since I have first came here in 1975. I was 21 years old, so do the math. And there is much, of course, to celebrate about Korea's great journey in every field, but including in the greater participation of women and the contribution of women to Korea's great rise. But one reason I have to say that I kind of decided I was going to brave this topic, and for me this is a harder topic than talking about even North Korea's nuclear weapons or the alliance relationship and what we're going to do in Yongsan, is I was back in Korea. You know, one thing about former ambassadors to Korea and former diplomats to Korea and friends of Korea, once we're here, we always keep coming back. You know, you kind of can't get rid of us. But I had not been in Korea for a while, of course, because we weren't traveling, the pandemic. And I came back last December, and it was in the midst of a political campaign. And I saw a lot of, you know, as I always do, old friends and their children, and kind of this extended family of friends in Korea I now have. I consider many people as close as family or closer. And I really was struck by how the issue of gender rights, feminism, I mean, the fact that there were these words, English words that had taken on sometimes a very toxic meaning, anti-feminism, was really kind of rife in Korea. And I remember actually, and I'm talking mostly to young women, but not all women today, I met a lot of young men who expressed this frustration and anger that I was really shocked by, because it wasn't consistent with where I thought Korea had moved, and also with just the facts that notwithstanding all the progress that's been made in Korea, clearly, you know, statistics show, data shows, and I think Koreans are very respectful of data, that you know, women have kind of a long way to go. I mean, particularly when it comes to things like equal pay and economic opportunity, when measured against other OECD countries or whatever benchmark you want to make, or just generally. But there was a lot of emotion around this issue, and it had become very politicized. So I was disturbed by that, and it did make me kind of think a little more about where we are, not just in Korea, if I can say we, but also in the United States. And I guess my other kind of background on this is, I mean, things were happening in the US too, which is where I live now. I live in Washington, DC, and last month I saw that there was I brought, you know, some people still read paper newspapers. We have American journalists here, not too often, but I happened to see, and it's August 26th last year in the Washington Post, it's an advertisement, it's a full-page advertisement. It says, "Women of the United States, we stand together," and a lot of people signing. But it was an advertisement taken out by the League of Women Voters of the United States. The League of Women Voters, for those of you who may not have heard of it, is a very long-standing institution in the United States of women voters that was designed to encourage voting, not only by women, but by everybody, but civic engagement. And I always thought of the League of Women Voters as kind of women of my mother's generation who wore like nice pillbox hats and gloves, kind of like EWA students used to wear. But that's a joke for those of you who were there a long time ago. But this full-page ad they took out on the anniversary of the 1920 certification of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which solidified the right to vote for women, or they say some women, in the United States. But what this says, I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but then it goes on to say, I was really surprised, we now have fewer rights than women have in decades in the United States. We cannot celebrate women's equality today because we are far from equal in our democracy. And goes on to talk about why, and including the loss of fundamental reproductive rights afforded to generations before us, as well as voting rights. So I mention this not to get into a discussion particularly about specific issues in the United States, but to say this, I think, feeling of things, of gender issues, if you like, at another level of politicization, if you like, and even polarization, a much used word, is not unique to Korea. I see it in the United States as well. And I think it's something that it's good to have a conversation about, both because I think that that's something that we Koreans and Americans have gotten better at doing together. Perhaps we can learn something from each other and understand it better, but also because I think it's very, very important to our relationship. So kind of what I thought I would do is to just kind of warm this up, hopefully, and kick it off, is to talk a little bit about, you know, my own life, especially in Korea, my kind of longest attachment to it. It emboldens me because I think this is a friendly audience to maybe give you a few observations about Korean women. You know, people always say, "What do you think of Korean women?" You know, or the issues of Korean. So, and I usually have kind of stuck to my talking points. That's what you do when you're in government. I've tried to think just a little bit more personally about that now over the years. And then kind of ask the question of, and I've kind of also partially answered it, but why does this matter? Why is this relevant to something I did work a long time on, as did Ambassador Burkhardt and some from our embassy and many people in this room, on US-Korean relations, US-Korean relations. And it's so meaningful, if I can say again, to do this here at IHWA, a university for education of women founded with the support of Americans, American women, and which has played such a role itself in building not only the ties between our peoples, but really building the kind of shared values that we have together. So anyway, a little bit more, if you can stand it, about me, because people ask. I grew up in Arizona and in the American Southwest. I had never been east of the Rocky Mountains, really. But I got interested in Asia for a reason I think a lot of university students get interested in the topic. I had some great professors. I had some great mentors. And I was always interested in kind of the outside world. And again, I think there are many, many students here today, whether you're from Korea or the United States or from other countries, who maybe just get interested for whatever reason. And Asia interested me for a number of reasons. I mean, one was, if you like, a kind of a family reason. I realized that even though I did not come from a well-traveled international family, my father had fought in World War II against Japan. My uncle had fought in Korea. The young men I knew, and some whom I dated, had either been to Vietnam and come back or done everything they could not to go. So it occurred to me, even in the, if you like, the big deserts of Arizona, that Asia kind of mattered. This is before the rise of China and everything else, and moreover, when Nixon had gone to China. We had no relations with this huge country called China that I had just gotten interested in, because it's another history, another culture, another civilization. So I ended up, again, thanks to a wonderful professor I had, studying in the University of Hong Kong for a year or so. And that kind of gave me the bug to, maybe that's not the right word to use anymore, but it really motivated me to do more on Asia. And I had the opportunity to come to Korea. I wanted to come to Asia, and I was asked to come to Korea in the Peace Corps in 1975. And in those days, Peace Corps volunteers were not being sent to universities because there was a lot of political unrest there that Peace Corps volunteers kind of inevitably got intertwined and involved in, and that was considered not part of their duties. We were sent down to the countryside, and where actually I wanted to go. I was very interested in a kind of an anthropological way, I guess, although I wasn't an anthropologist. Of just seeing, I knew that Korea was a country in transition, and I wanted to see this transition for myself. And I guess I could say I really did in many ways. But it wasn't an easy place. It wasn't considered an easy assignment for anybody, but it was considered to be especially difficult for women. And I'll talk about a couple of those reasons in a moment, but let's just say I had a lot more time by myself in a room, while male Peace Corps volunteers in other towns were going out drinking with their friends and jumping around and doing things. And, there was kind of, now I'm saying something about it now, there was kind of an expectation. It's very conservative. I mean, Chungnam was considered very conservative. Yesan was a Yangban town. We were supposed to live like Yangban, if you even know what that means. But, there was a certain ideal of how you were supposed to live. And it was very hard to live within those constraints as a foreign woman. It was probably kind of hard for many of the young Korean women. My saving grace was that my co-teachers in my school, in the little English department, I taught English, what else could I teach, were all young women about my age. And so we were like this little tight group. And I think I learned something about little tight groups in Korea and how supportive those can be. But I also had, let's say, a lot of time to read. The places I learned about in my Peace Corps training as I studied this Korean, all these words I can't use anymore, but I learned, you had to learn words like tabang, which is a coffee house. And so one of the first things I learned in Korean was tabang에 갈까요? Shall we go to a tabang? Have a cup of coffee? And that was fine if you were in Seoul. That was fine if you were in a town where they were training Peace Corps volunteers. But when I was in Yesan and there was one tabang, and I would say, tabang에 갈까요? People looked shocked. Proper young women did not go to tabang. Now there are no more tabang anymore, so it's not an issue. And similarly, if I said to my co-teachers at school, male or female, and Yesan, I said, let's go on a trip somewhere, over the weekend. So where will we stay? Yogwan. We can stay in a Yogwan. Which, again, don't really exist in Korea anymore, but I think in Japanese, they still use the term ryokan, which some foreigners know, but I say, you're staying in a Yogwan. Again, shock. you've stayed in a yogwan? I mean, I had to kind of reassure them I wasn't a completely fallen woman. I mean, so it was clear that I wasn't going to be able to live up to the expectations of what conservative young women, unmarried women, did in Korea. And of course, as a foreigner, they cut me some slack. They kind of had to. But it was also part of that era when, and I found this as I went into diplomacy too, that it was almost like, well, maybe you can just be like an honorary man in some ways, in some small ways. And that's not quite the fix either, right? But that was the kind of challenge. But I'm finally getting to my point here. I had all this time. And one of the things about the work style in Korea that I think was most challenging for all of us, men and women alike, was the expectation that you arrived, I don't know if this is still true, President Kim or Dean, but maybe a little different at university now, but you had to arrive at your workplace, in my case, the gyomushil, the teacher's room, before the vice principal got there, and you had to leave after he left. And so in that case, in those days, and by the way, there was class on Saturdays too, you had to get there at about 7 in the morning and leave maybe 8 o'clock at night or later. And the men would all gotten drink, which in a way, fortunately, I didn't have to do or couldn't do. It would have been unthinkable. But it's a lot of hours. It's a lot of hours, and only so many hours you can study Korean. I should have studied more, but I decided, well, I'm going to do what a lot of Koreans do. I'm going to study for a test. I'm going to study for the diplomatic test. Why not? And by the way, and I think you probably took the Foreign Service test. If you take the Foreign Service test in the United States, I think it's still this way, almost anything can count as studying. Read a novel, learn about some music, do a little bit of economics. So I did that. And it also gave me a little bit of standing, because it meant that what I could now tell my Gilgam Sensenim when I wanted to miss class on Saturday and go to Seoul to take the exam, I practiced what I was going to say in Korea, and I said, could I miss class to go? And his answer was very Korean. I always remember it said, 공부를 했냐? Have you studied? And are you going to pass? And if you can guarantee you're going to pass, you can go. But I did pass, and I joined the Foreign Service. And so I do credit, I guess, in a way, not just Korea, but maybe some of the constraints I faced as a young woman in Korea to motivating me, disciplining me to take this exam and to pass it. And I went on to serve, first in China. We had finally normalized relations with China. But I'd also, this is getting a little longer than I expected, I knew this would happen, but I'd also entered the Foreign Service as women of my generation did, and again, this is in the late 70s, and only a few years earlier had the United States Foreign Service allowed women, married women, I wasn't married, but married women to be diplomats. It's kind of shocking, right? So not surprisingly, there weren't that many women. There were other reasons too, who were actually in the Foreign Service who had careers in it. So that was kind of the atmosphere of it. By the 70s, and in a way, thanks to a lawsuit and as well as societal change, women were coming in. But what they were doing is they were assigning, and again, this is well established now, assigning women to areas of specialization that were, in a way, less prestigious and less likely to lead to higher ranks. So I was assigned to be, as most women were, either a consular officer or administrative officer, in my case, consular. Very important work. And I was a consular officer in China, did a lot of other things, but I wanted to be a political officer. I wanted to be a political officer, and I was trying to figure out how to do it. And I saw while I was in China, there was an opening for a political officer in Korea, 1983. And I already spoke some Korean. And at that time, I know it's hard to believe now, especially, there were very few people in the United States, in the United States Foreign Service, who spoke Korean or wanted to learn Korean. But I had this little test result that said I spoke, some Korean, not good enough, but some Korean. And I tried to use that to wedge open the door. And I wedged it open far enough that I got the assignment, basically after literally the HR department checked with every other man of my grade who had any Korean to see if they wanted the job, literally. And when I finally was assigned, and the ambassador in Seoul learned about it, he said, there has never been a woman to be a political officer in Seoul. The Koreans will never accept it. Not the Americans, the Koreans won't accept it. She should come and be a consular officer. But fortunately, by that time, and this is where the rules had changed, and he couldn't do that. He couldn't do it, so I came. And as soon as I got here, because I worked hard on my Korean, he was like, oh, actually, this kind of works. So that's part of just kind of wedging open the door, I think is the one point I want to make. And the second is, I had to find, and it wasn't so conscious, some comparative advantage I had. And in this case, it was that sliver of Korean language. I don't think they really cared that I lived in Korea and I knew what a tabak and a yogwan was, and I knew the rhythm of middle school. But I had that Korean language, and I could build on that, and that's how I got my foot in the door. And of course, I was here in Korea in the 1980s for an incredible period. And I stayed for 6 years, 1983 to 1989. So in the 70s, as a young one in my 20s, I saw the beginnings, not the beginnings, I mean, but in the midst of this extraordinary economic transformation that was really changing people's lives. And in the 80s, I saw an equally impressive and in many ways equally improbable, if you like, from the outside world, and certainly from conventional American wisdom, if you like, transformation in the political sphere. And that had me hooked on Korea. And I left in 1989. I was sent actually by the State Department for a year to do more on Asian studies after a decade. And then guess what? There were no jobs for me in Asia. But the Cold War ended and I went to Europe for 15 years. And Otake Bonika, after 15 years of working in Europe, which within our system was actually much more open to women working in those areas, I had a chance to come back and work on Korea and on Asia again. And so things happened. So I definitely took the long road. If you think it was 15 years when I left Korea in the 1980s until I came back as ambassador, it was almost 20 years. Almost 20 years. I definitely took the long road. And I think that's also something that, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily recommend, but you know, it's not so bad either, because I'm very grateful I had those almost 20 years doing all of that other, doing all those other things, and bringing some of that experience, which I hope is relevant, to my time here in Korea. So it came at the right time. I was very glad. So anyway, I was going to say a couple of things then about some observations about Korean women, I guess, and from the 1970s, and why I think you said that people remember me from that time. You know, I think that to be a good diplomat, especially overseas, and I know we have ambassadors here, and it's great to see they're women. You know, I think a lot of our job is to understand the country we're in, and to give that kind of context and understanding of what's going on there. It's not the same thing as saying they're always right and we have to agree with them, obviously, but what's really going on? And I think that having had that perspective from the 1970s and the 1980s helped me to do that job better as ambassador when I came. And there was always one thing, and Korean, you know, even in sort of the later days, if you like, there was still, I think, among Americans, including the diplomats, and John, you know many of them who've done that, kind of a stereotype, if you like, about Korean women, because in a Neo-Confucian system, they're not very visible, and you know, most meetings you go to, I mean, at least up until recent times, you know, there are no other women in the room. That's begun to change, but very few senior women. We have some of them there. We have a lot of pioneers here. But you know, there was a kind of a hidden part of Korea, I think hidden to most men, which I felt as a woman here and living here, I got a little bit of insight into. And I thought, and I'm going to quote Laurel Kendall, who was also a Peace Corps volunteer, she's my sunbae, who became an anthropologist. She became an anthropologist because she got very interested in Korean women. This is way back in the 60s and 70s. This is now half a century ago, but we still remember it. And she got very interested in mudang, in shamanism, as an area that women kind of dominated in Korea, right? And I'm just going to read you what her description of, and this is what I saw in Korea, even in the conservative place like Chungcheon-namdo in the 1970s. Public powerlessness and private strength. This contradiction permeates a Korean woman's entire life. She follows a few steps behind her husband on village lanes, but once inside the house, she uses a sharp tongue and managerial acumen to good effect. In Kut, you know, the shamanistic ceremony that's usually done by a woman, she transmutes this contradiction into high drama and comedy. That's K-culture. She acknowledges the powerful with flattery and an occasional treat, but she shouts back even at the gods when they presume too much. So when some of my male counterparts, male American, and I'm not all are in this category, would sort of have a stereotype about Korean women based on their experience. You know, these were the Korean women I knew, and 45 years ago. And as I moved into Korean life in Seoul and in Busan in the 80s, and certainly as ambassador, you know, that sense of the importance of and I'm not saying this in just a casual way, of Korean women and the society and how to understand that, while still evolving, was only deepened. You know, and I do think that the story, and maybe this is something I'd love to see some students at EWA work on, and I think many already have, but I think, you know, the story of Korea's modern rise has been told many times. It's a very impressive story. I do think that kind of women's role in it has been a little bit overlooked in some ways. You know, when I think about, and some of this I only understand better in hindsight, the Korea I first knew in the 1970s, still 20 years after the war, you know, it was the women, and I'm talking about the ordinary women, if you like. I mean, not so privileged, but the ordinary women who were rebuilding this country. It was the young women who were getting a middle school education while they worked in a Nike factory. It was the widows and the divided families with women left here, sometimes on their own, who were, including very educated ones, selling in the market so they could send their children, and usually preferably their sons, to school. It was women who were opening the small businesses that sometimes stayed too small. And I think that's been a little overlooked. And I've found, trying to understand that sometimes through literature now in Korea, I thought that the author Park Won-seo talks about the post-war experience, and that helped me to kind of understand a little bit more about what Korea went through after the war and how women's experience was so central to that. I think about Korea's first woman lawyer I met when she was working in Yeouido in the 1980s, and I was covering students and labor was my brief, so that meant going to a lot of demonstrations. We didn't have cell phones then, including some right in front of this campus in Yonsei, but going out to Yeouido to see Lee Tae-yong, who was Korea's first woman lawyer and had dedicated herself to changing some of the rules around inheritance and family registration that really left women in a terrible way when they lost their husbands. So I think it'd be a kind of a nice project to kind of think about who's been overlooked here. The New York Times actually has, we have somebody here from the New York Times, so I think it's the New York Times, started a series a couple of years ago called Overlooked No More, and it focuses on people through obituaries, people who died since the 19th century, who didn't have obituaries in the New York Times. It turns out a lot of those people are women, and I'm reading for the first time about these people, and I think there's a lot more people like that in Korea that we probably need to read about. Because they live lives of great contribution, and somehow in the narrative, at least the broader narrative, have been a little bit lost. But of course, I've talked a lot about kind of the old days now. There's so many ways in which Korea has changed. I won't try to talk about all of them, but certainly I observed when I came back as ambassador in 2008, it was striking to me that the preference for sons had just seemed to have completely disappeared, and that had been so strong. That educational opportunities were as important. I mean, I'm talking about the parents now. Daughters' education was as important as sons. Maybe there's a slight variation, I don't know. Again, I'm opening these up for debate, but very striking to me how the educational leap forward for women had been so great. And it really seemed that the formal discrimination, if you like, was mostly gone. And I do think, and I think again of Lee Tae-yong here, it took democratization for that to happen. It took a long time. Took a long time. But also, in an even equally impressive way, the provision of things like parental leave and childcare in a way that still is, I think, kind of unheard of in most parts of the United States, is a very, very impressive move forward and effort forward in Korea. But of course, as I know that we hear a lot, and maybe some of you get tired of hearing it. You know, again, as I said, when you look at the measures, Korea is still far behind in a lot of ways. At least according to traditional measures. The Global Gender Gap Index of 2022 had South Korea ranked 99th out of 146 countries, especially weak in economic participation and opportunity and political empowerment. I know we had Janet Yellen, the Secretary of Treasury here recently, who talked about, again, the fact that highly educated women in Korea are so highly educated, but still fill only 20% of management roles. That's probably a rather generous count in some ways. They're more likely to be irregular workers. And of course, the pay gap is the highest gap in the OECD. So there's, I think, things clearly to work on. I know I find when I talk to, if you like, kind of the older generation in Korea, of which I'm one, of course, sometimes I think there's a response that things are changing so much now, we just have to wait a while, and it'll all kind of even out. But I'm not sure it's going to be that easy because it is so complicated. And I think it's going to take some attention from all of us to think about, how, and not take it for granted that we're inexorably moving forward in a certain way. It's going to take a lot of thought, and we're already seeing that in some of the backlash, if you like, that we see in both countries, and the debate about some things that maybe a few years ago and maybe even now just seem beyond debate. So finally, in terms of why, this is me playing the former ambassador. Why does this matter to U.S.-Korean relations? Janet Yellen, as the Secretary of Treasury when she was here, I think you said it very well, of women in this country. It's true in the United States too, but here is such a huge untapped resource. I know sometimes for younger people it feels like huge new competition, but it really is an untapped resource. It's absolutely essential to a country whose greatest resource is the talent of its people. It has to be harnessed. So there are economic reasons for it, and I think we're all thinking about this post-pandemic in the United States as well, as we struggle with the kind of back to work and the gaps that we've seen, not just in things like pay and opportunity, but childcare and just ability to get to work. I think those are all issues here. But, it's also an issue of values, right? And we have administrations in both countries, and I think there's bipartisan support for it here, and I hope in the United States, for the notion that the U.S.-Korea relationship has become so much broader and deeper that it's not only about the security relationship and the very traditional relationship we have to come to each other's help and defense and keep the area secure or even to grow our economies, but also that we really are united in an alliance of values. And I don't think you can have a real alliance of values unless you take into account the issues of rights, of equal rights, of addressing discrimination, and of moving forward in the spirit of our democracy and of human rights for all. So whether it's in the alliance or in Korea's own ambition, as expressed by the current government of being a global pivotal state, and there's been many expressions of this, playing a larger role in the world, which is certainly poised to do. Again, it's really not, I think, going to be able to achieve its entire potential in this role, in this way, until it really begins to address even more energetically some of these issues. And I don't have the answers for all of them, but I know we need to address them. And I have to say, finally, that when I think about IHWA's history, when I think about the work that's being here now, and I learned just earlier today about the melding of new programs in AI and engineering with the values of humanities and liberal arts, with the values of IHWA, with this incredible kind of international focus and outlook that IHWA has, it gives me great optimism that notwithstanding all there is to be worried about now and some of the concerns that I think we share in both our countries, and hopefully we can learn from as we talk with each other, our own experiences, it gives me a lot of hope and optimism for the future. So thank you very much for inviting me today. It's great to be back.
Hello, hi. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, students. Thank you all. I think we consider ourselves IHWA family or an extended family of IHWA. It was a great, and now, of course, Ambassador Stevens, you are included. It was a great speech, and I must admit, the Yalgwan and the Tabang references brought me back, and so again, I'm of that generation. You said that it was very difficult to sort of think about what you were going to say today because you know this country so well, and actually the subject so well, but it was also very, very difficult to figure out what to have this conversation about because again, I know you so well, and again, this topic is so well, but one of the factors that has been so unique about you is that, you know, the Korean American perspectives, we have a lot of Koreans who go abroad and now have perspectives there, and we have a lot of Korean American young women and young and not so young women who also bring that perspective. But it's unusual for an American to have an American and Korean perspective of gender and within this country. So you bring a very unique perspective to all of this. And I was very interested to hear about all the things that you found that were commonalities between the US and Korea. But you know, you've known Korea for a long time. You've come back and forth, and you've seen Korea for the past 5 decades. And you talked about the things that have changed. What have you found that actually that hasn't changed, that surprised you because that hasn't changed?
That's interesting. Okay. I mean, I think what hasn't changed is this kind of drive I see in Korea for kind of always moving forward. Sometimes maybe not in the best possible way, but you know, I still see, and I know there's talk about the younger generation, there always is, being a little bit different, but this sense that you've got to, whatever you have, have to try to make it better. So you know, you see it in the physical surroundings here. You know, I come back after a few years, and you know, that building wasn't any good anymore. We're going to do something different. You know, but I think that hasn't. I don't think that has changed. I don't think that the Koreans have ever really sort of settled back and said, kind of, we're done, right? And I think it does feed, and it hasn't changed in both a positive and negative way, is intense competitiveness, right? I mean, competition almost with yourself. But with everyone else. And I think that does, I mean, underlie, I mean, maybe part of why this kind of tension within the younger generation over gender issues. I think it's misplaced that it's over gender, but I think it does come a little bit out of this hyper competitiveness, which again is kind of like, you know, they used to, and when it comes to education, you see it the most of all. But I mean, I remember hearing the expression of, you know, 교육열, right? Education fever, right? Which is a good thing, and but in Korea, it's also, I think over time, and this hasn't changed, become kind of, forgive me, but kind of 교육병, right? I mean, like an education sickness, and I think it kind of makes it very difficult for young people, especially, and now with Korea's welcome prosperity, you know, people have more opportunities, but the competitiveness gets greater and greater, and then you see the competitiveness in other forms. So another thing actually that hasn't changed, I mean, is Koreans. I think Koreans, generally speaking, are very observant and very sensitive to the kind of the look of things, and that hasn't changed. And so it's just, again, with Korea's sophistication, with its prosperity, it's taken on kind of a more heightened form. And I think it expresses itself in very wonderful ways in terms of the creativity of the arts, and everything has become K-pop and so on. But it also has this kind of negative way, and I mean, I saw this in the past too, in terms of a lot of highly judgmental approaches sometimes to things that deviate from what's considered to be the best or the norm.
I know you mentioned this in your speech as well, but you talked about it in terms of the conflict, and maybe that comes from the education competition between men and women in Korea. But how do you, I mean, could you talk a little bit more about how you see, from an outside point of view, why there is so much tension in that relationship?
Yeah. You know, I mean, what I'm told, and again, I rely on my colleagues and my friends, because it's hard for me to see as an outsider this directly, is that it's a younger generation that is in this highly competitive environment, and perhaps this younger generation is the first one that's really seen women, you know, come into a lot of professional fields in such numbers, and it is a time when there is a sense in the context of waning opportunities for everybody. So So that's, and inequality, right? I think that's the other thing. And of course, we see it in the movies, or, you know, that I have great discussions in the United States, you know, when people watch these Korean movies about, wow, you know, do people really feel that way about these things? And of course, they're movies. But this sense that the path of opportunity is not as open as it is, so as it used to be, and so, and therefore, you know, anything that's perceived as being a disadvantage, and of course here, what I hear most often is well, men have to serve in the military and women don't, and therefore women are being advantaged, and, you know, and everything else is equal, so, you know, how is this fair? And, you know, so obviously it's a conversation Koreans have. I mean, I wonder sometimes about this, if the Korean government or legislators ever thought about mandatory public service for everybody, which is something I'm in favor of in the United States, actually, in some ways. But those are political debates, civic debates to have, and I hope they can occur here rather than this kind of politicization of, if you like, of an issue, which I think can be very, very destructive.
Another aspect is that you talked about the strength of Korean women, which sort of belie the frail Asian women perspective that a lot of people have in the West. But at the same time, and I think that is sort of a misconception a lot of people have, especially about Korean women who have within the household such a loud voice, if I could say. But on the other hand, there's also that versus how much of a gap there is between inequality in gender in Korea. How is it that we have two such different aspects of the female psyche in Korea?
Well, that's too deep a question for me. I usually just answer all these questions,
No,
but I mean, my slightly academic answer, and I'm not a scholar of Korea or anything else, is that, and again, I'd love to hear reactions either now or later on, is that sort of the Neo-Confucian system, which was adopted with such enthusiasm during the Joseon Dynasty, really did create a system that was very, very prescribed for everybody, right? And it really took root. But that underneath that, there were other aspects of Korean culture. I mean, going back to Goguryeo and just kind of, if you like, Korean culture itself. So there was that informal culture that never really changed, but the high culture was this Neo-Confucianism, which was perfected in Korea, and it still seems to have kind of a big impact. I was kind of bemused. I'm going to get myself in trouble somewhere here, I'm sure, but I'm not sure where all the landmines are. But I was here over Chuseok, and it's interesting to me because I was in Chuseok in the countryside. I remember what that was like, and I remember when everyone really went to the countryside. Now nobody's from the countryside, so they all, it's really changed, and that's part of changing families and roles and everything. But there was an article in the newspaper which reported, I think, quite consistent with what I hear from Korean women, is like, wow, Chuseok is like my least favorite holiday because all I do is cook dishes and wash them, right, for like hours and hours, and there's all kinds of family tensions. And it's not unknown in the U.S., but very. So there's an article in the newspaper where the head of the kind of the Department of Rights, that to still look after these traditions, had said, now, we're going to simplify Chuseok. You don't have to have as much food, just one kind of meat and no more, chun and this and that and the other thing. And we're going to make this easier for everyone. But the head of the rituals it was a man, of course, and he never said, and the men are going to help out. That didn't occur to him.
I noticed that. I noticed that
You
article,
did?
yes. Because my husband and I talked about this. Let's take this out, or and he would say, well, I think that can keep, And it ended up being, we took one item out, but that was it. But it was because I think he's not the one that's doing the cooking.
Yeah. You need your microphone.
But
we really are having a conversation.
Yeah, the irony of it. I mean, it feels like we're just. But you talk. I mean, I find it amazing that there are so commonalities between gender relations. It's actually much more common to find an American and a Korean female that have similar experiences than even within an American and a man and a female, and the same within Korea as well. But do you find that, that this is again the problem, in not just in Korea but in the U.S. as well, the lack of women in leadership roles? I mean, what kind of implications do you think that would have on this generation and the generations of future? And do you see that as a problem, or a problem that is being resolved?
You mean in Korea or at both places?
Or in both places.
Yeah, yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, on your first comment, I guess you made me think. I used to get asked by a lot of the men I worked with, and when most of the embassies I worked in, it was mostly men. It's changed again in recent years, but especially when it came to Korea, it was kind of like, wow, how can you deal with Korea? The men are the men are so awful. I mean, American men would say it must be awful, and kind of I didn't ever quite say it, but it's like it's not that different. I mean, it helped to try to, and I think what I tried to do was, again, understand the culture and historical context, and be, perhaps, if I can say, more forgiving of some things that would be said to me. And I would be treated a different way, generally, because I was a foreigner, but I could be a little more understanding. I could see it in a kind of an intellectualist context. But yeah, I didn't see it as like just wildly sort of, worse or something. It was just, in a pattern. In terms of, women, why is it important to have women leaders? I mean, I'm not one of those people, and I don't want to say one of those people, it sounds bad, but I don't think that a country or a world ruled by women would automatically become a more peaceful and better governed place. I mean, we're all human beings, and holding power is a complicated thing, and we need to have institutions that understand human foibles and support us, and we all face those problems. But I do know from my own career, and I think there are many people here who've been in a career for longer, that whatever the work is, whether it's diplomacy or political leadership, I mean, we have some incredible political pioneers. I'm not going to call them out here, but pioneers here and leadership here in Korea, and in ministries, and the environment, and politics. But you just have a better decision process. You get more perspectives. I think women do bring their own experience. And sometimes they, Prime Minister Lee Hong-gu is here. I'm so honored. Thank you. Sorry, great to see you. And so I say, women do go through life differently. And I think when I'm generally not a believer, and maybe in one leader makes all those decisions, but I think that women generally, not always, can bring not only having gone through different experiences in life, but sometimes some greater experience in listening and consolidating and trying to reach consensus. And I think those are attributes that any leader needs, but I think you can find them in women leaders, maybe hopefully more often.
Well, it touches upon something that used to be this case that I think there was a book written by a former CNN person, like work like a man, succeed like a woman, or something along those lines.
Maybe it's the other way around.
Is it the other way around? But the thing was that, you are expected to win the game like a man because, you have to play by certain rules. And then once you're there, then you can sort of rule like a woman.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, no, I think, again, I don't know if you feel that way but in my generation, I think that I mean, in diplomacy, they used to used to talk about it in certain diplomatic assignments that, well, they'll treat you like an honorary man. Like that was often said if you went to Saudi Arabia. Don't worry, they'll treat you like an honorary man. And some of the people had that, and it's like, well, great, but I kind of bought into that. It's like, you try to kind of just put your gender aside, and just pretend that you don't see gender in me. And you know, it shouldn't be the first thing you say, I'm an American, I'm this, I'm that, and so deal with me that way. And I think what's happened over the last some years, and I do now see it as a positive thing, is that that's not necessarily the best way to lead or to be a diplomat or to do whatever your work is. That all of us bring different qualities and experiences and characteristics to a job. Gender is one of them, but gender varies a lot too, experience varies a lot too. And the aim has to be to have as diverse a set of experiences and including gender experiences, I think, as you can. And that's generally going to lead you, and I think there's a lot of research that's been done, especially in companies, to a better outcome. But it has changed, and I think that's a positive thing, but we have to kind of keep going in that direction. Yeah. You know, I also wanted to add, I mean, one thing that's been interesting to me in not only in Korea, but in other countries I've served over the years, but in particular, since I've spent so long in Korea, that women in Korea who were highly educated, oftentimes, almost always Ewha graduates, oftentimes I mean, I talked about how I tried to parlay my little Korean, you know, thing into something else. Women who really spoke excellent foreign languages, had incredible experience, and but they couldn't get jobs in Korean companies. So they got jobs at embassies, right? And certainly, I mean, the American embassy over the years was a huge beneficiary of this. I think a lot of international organizations and so on, and really became, you know, had international careers in some ways because other doors were closed to them. And even now, I have to say, although, as I said, I certainly praise, and I think rightly, the kind of official parental leave and child care options and so on there are in Korea. I know the fact is the workplace culture has not really kept up with that, with actually enforcing that. So I do welcome the fact that now if you work at the American embassy, I'm sure if you work at the Norwegian or other embassies, the Swiss embassy, you have women who are very loyal because they've gotten jobs, they've moved up, they've been able to have children, go away, come back, and not face some of the pressures that come from the Korean work culture, not only in terms of those kinds of life, whatever, you know, life-work balances, but also in terms of late nights out with the boss and all those other expectations. So that's been a very positive thing for the, you know, for a lot of the foreign presence here, including foreign countries. I think that.
Too.
Yeah, and for Korean women, I think it's been a great professional path. And I just hope that Korean companies now see what a huge resource this is, not only in women, you know, coming up now, but also women who have experience. That is part of that huge underused resource that Korea has.
I agree. I mean, I think I wrote somewhere recently that if I had been a man, that I probably would not have joined the foreign press, that I would have joined the Korean press
Right.
and risen up.
Right.
But it's because, and even with my linguistic side of it, but I think I felt that a foreign media organization would treat me more fairly and give me more opportunities than a Korean organization, and which was true at the time.
true.
And so that's where I went.
But that means those Korean companies lost that talent. Yeah.
They may not feel that way, but I believe so.
Yeah.
But definitely that was sort of the way it goes. And I think it goes, it may be reflected in other countries as well in terms of where people go. As you pointed out in the audience, we have, I mean, it's very unusual. I mean, I have to say that we have like 3 female foreign ministers in the audience, which I think, when you think about the former Korean ministers who were
Former
female.
ministers, that's right, yeah.
We have 3 of them in the audience,
Yeah.
which is almost, I would say, 10% of the entire number of former Korean ministers who are female, if I'm not mistaken. I would think so, yeah? I think at some point, it would be invaluable to our students to get their perspectives about how they feel, how far Korea has to go, and maybe much further. We have
I'd love to hear that. You know, and I have to say, I mean, I have a shout out to all of them, but I first met the former Minister of Environment, Minister Kim, when I was working at the State Department. This is my years in the wilderness. You know, my 20 years away from Korea, and I had a job in Washington working on. This is during the second George W. Bush administration, working on the environment. I'm sorry, now I have another story to tell. But so I hadn't been in Korea in years and years and years, and but there was a meeting, a ministerial in Helsinki of women ministers of the environment. And because, of course, Finland's Minister of the Environment was a woman. And so I got to go. I wasn't a minister. I was several rungs down, but I was an American, so, you know, they sent me. So I got to go, and that's where we met. And it was great that Korea had a woman to send to be the women ministers of environment, and she was so effective and she was so great. But another sign of, you know, why do you need women leaders? You need them because if Korea is going to be a global pivotal state and be out there, you know, you've got to have your representatives. And it was nice to see you again.
Yeah. And I do see, we have former Ministry of Environment. I know her by so many other titles, but former Minister
Right,
Kim
many
Young-jung,
titles, yeah.
yes. We have the former Minister of, I don't know if the English is going to be right, but small and medium industries ministry. Former Minister Park Young-sun. We have, of course, our IWA's own now, our former Minister for Trade and Foreign Policy? No, just Foreign Minister. For Minister Kang Kyung-ha. So we have all three, welcome. And again, we don't want to point out too much the fact that they are female, because they each in their own right were wonderful ministers and government officials, and it had nothing to do with the fact that they were female. I think I was in a forum in Sweden, and they had three Swedish ministers in the foreign section, and they were out there and they sat together, and the first thing they said was, "You see us three women ministers, and you think it's like, oh, they're there because they're women." I said, no. We're here because we're good. You know, we're good at what we do. And so, or I think they said we are the best at what we do.
You know, I mean, and I do think it continues to be a fact that women sort of have to be overqualified, right? I'm still struck by how there really is a double standard when it comes to assessing people for a job, whether it's a political job or a job in the civil service, and I think women ourselves, we have to be careful of it. And you see a resume of a woman, and you say, "Well, I'm not sure she's fully qualified," you know. And I know, because I'm actually doing something like that now. When it comes to, if it's a resume from a man, you don't hear it the same way. Now, some people would say, well, it's because a lot of younger women are rising up; they don't have the experience yet. But I think we have to be careful, actually, of this notion of who's qualified for things. Because my experience is that the women who get into these jobs, they usually have not only checked every box, they've like checked a whole bunch of others too. And
they still think they're not qualified.
And then women themselves say, well, maybe I need just a little more experience. So it's how you feel about your own sense of confidence as well. That, yeah, okay, I may not be totally ready for this job, but let me, I'm going to do it.
Okay, that subject was brought up in a recent article. I forget where it was. It may have been from one of our organizations and our journalists, about how there's an article about a study done in which it found that women did not aspire to be leaders in their organizations, that the percentage of women who wanted to become leaders in their organization were lower than for men. Do you think that is the case? Or are they missing out?
I don't know. I mean, I also think we were, as I said, talking about this a little bit earlier too, in a way. I think now in this period, at least in the United States, after this 2 or 3 years we've been in, where I think men and women are kind of reassessing their professional lives and their lives as a whole, and what they want to prioritize. So I think there's a reassessment going on, but no, I mean, and I think we have moved, and probably happily so, in my view, a little bit away from what was the lean in thing of, it's just up to you women, just work a little harder, do a little more, it's all up to you, and you're going to get there.
Definitely,
I think
no.
women are a little
that's-
tired of that,
yeah.
and maybe men are, and so, but I'm not sure that translates into they don't aspire to leadership positions. I mean, I think that. And certainly, I mean, I have to assume in Korea too. I mean, we all want to I think have meaning and success and in our work. But maybe there's a reassessment of what is this going to, what are the trade-offs I have to make here? Yeah, and where am I really headed? Maybe that's a healthy thing for everybody.
And I think there's an issue of many other responsibilities society puts on a woman versus the responsibilities that they put on a man in certain societies.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. Yeah.
In which you feel that you have to make priority choices that are different.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I know while we're going to talk a little bit more, I think I'm going to, and I would think there's an audience filled with brimming questions that you want to bring up. I would like to get, I'm going to come to all of you first. Well, a little later, but we'll get a question from a student, and then I'll allow Ambassador Stevens to ask you a question, and then we'll have that relationship. Okay, our students, any questions that you have for us? Oh, I see a question right here.
Hello. First of all, I wanted to say thank you for this incredible speech and giving us the opportunity to join you here. My name is Luna Riedel. I'm currently a first semester student at EY-GSIS. And I wanted to ask, so in the beginning you touched upon this topic already where you said, oh yeah, I was applying for position X and someone was, oh, so as a woman. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to ask about how you experienced any other gender inequality throughout your career and how you dealt with this, and if you have any advice for us future women's leader that you can give to us upon our future way.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thanks. I appreciate that. I mean, Gia, you may have some advice too, I'm sure. But yeah, I guess we could call this gender inequality, but I guess I had to think, and this applies to Korea, but also to other places, and just to my own personality, I guess. I kind of had to think about if I wanted to develop relationships with people, that was certainly affected by gender. And in Korea there was, and again, when I came here in the 80s as a political officer, I actually remember the political counselor at the time saying to me when he said, well, we've never had a woman here, but he said, I'm an alcoholic and I can still work here, so I guess as a woman might be able to work here too. I guess the implication being that you can't join in the drinking culture. I said, well, thank you. Yeah, no, that's literally what he said. And actually, I do, as some people know here, I do like to drink, but men would not, Korean men, and some of you know this has changed a lot. That's changed a lot. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'll let you have your own judgment about that. But the culture was you develop these relationships by going out and drinking together and bonding, and that's not something that's as easy, for me to do, or that I really honestly wanted to do. But what I did do, and I've done in other places, because there are other cultural things, I guess I'd say, that are somewhat gender related, is I tried to find, I'm very activity oriented, which is a little bit Korean. So as some of you know, I don't play golf though, but I don't really want to. So I play tennis, as you know. I like to cycle, as has been mentioned. And I found that this is not so much gender related, but it's kind of that cycling in particular is kind of a great leveler. Right? That once we would have a cycling group, that like everything else in Korea, the cycling, it's about 1/3 cycling, 1/3 taking pictures, and 1/3 eating and drinking afterwards and during. So it's great. But you can have everything from, a university student to a former prime minister to an ambassador, and I found more women were joining it as I joined it. And this is how I sort of not only developed relationships, but how I tried to understand and learn a little bit more about Korea. So that's kind of how I tried to deal with, I mean, I wouldn't call it exactly gender inequality, but just, yeah, maybe just different kinds of perceptions of what you could do, but also my own preferences, really. No, otherwise, I mean, I think, again, maybe for my generation, too much of it, but I mean, I just had to, I think over the years, and maybe a lot of us of this age would feel this way, that the sort of what I regard as fairly minor insults, I just kind of developed a thick skin. Now, maybe too thick in some ways, maybe I put up with things I shouldn't have put up with, but that's kind of the life that I came from, right? But yeah, I think the other part of it, though, is just by, and I think we see this with, again, getting back to women's leaders, once you have a woman in the room, and I don't know if you found this, Foreign Minister Kong and some others, then your counterparts, whether they're in your own country or other countries, they feel a little bit more like, we'd better pay a little attention to other women too. And I hope that helps a bit.
I think I totally agree with you on maybe we were a little too thick-skinned. I asked myself that. Maybe if I had been less so, then maybe change could have come about a little quicker. Because I know that we've all been the only female in a group. Yeah. But I think, and we tried to do our best to be a good female, a good person, whatever role we were given, to be good at that role and tried extra hard. But maybe we should have paid more attention, or maybe we should have tried harder to have one more female in the room.
Right.
Maybe that we didn't reach far enough or high enough. Do you ever feel like that?
Yeah, I think so. I think I probably so. I mean, I certainly did try to, to ensure that I mean, not just ensure, but really actively look for, other women who are looking for jobs that I could help hire for. But ensure that other women in the room. But could I have done more? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that we sort of felt, again, it was this thing of, for a lot of the time, I think speaking for myself, I felt such a sense of insecurity. So again, it's like almost pay no attention to the fact that I'm a woman. Just and you will get comfortable with it. And certainly we've moved far beyond that now, and we have to move further. You made me think of, I always think of something. There's another book I'd recommend, and it's by another woman who, Foreign Service officer of my generation. Her name is Masha Jovanovic, and you may recognize her name because she was the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, who became more well known when she testified in Congress about an earlier chapter in U.S.-Ukrainian relations. And she wrote a book, it's kind of a memoir called Lessons from the Edge. And I mean, the book that's really, people have focused on, and I think the reason it's selling so well is, of course, about her time in Ukraine. But she talks about her earlier career in a variety of posts, including Somalia. And she kind of addresses this a little bit, and I think she sees writing this book as part of her trying to make that right in a way, almost. Not because she did anything bad, but it's like, I'm going to tell people things I didn't tell them before about, here are some of the challenges I had as a woman and discrimination I experienced, but also how I benefited from the State Department then beginning to address this. And I didn't feel I had to hide that either. I'm telling you the story of my career because it'll be helpful. So I think the other thing, and I'm trying to do, and maybe imperfectly, is be more honest. I mean, be more honest with myself but it takes some reflection.
True, and sometimes it feels like maybe it's a little too late. Sort of done here.
Yeah.
But
all
right, now I'm giving you the right to ask our guests any questions that you would like.
Oh my goodness. But do I have to direct it to a certain kind of guest, or maybe? Well, okay. But I'm going to ask. I mean, because Foreign Minister Kong, since she's here, and I haven't seen her, and she's a professor here. I don't know, and maybe it's not so much a question, but I mean, I would welcome your thoughts on your experience and what you see, and maybe particularly what Gia was talking about what are we kind of I'm not going to say you're never going to have I mean, you're not going to go back into government. You might, but now as you're out of government, I mean, looking back, what changes did you see during your tenure, and what do you see as the challenges going forward?
Well, you put me on the spot here.
I put you on the spot, but I figure you're used to it.
I let her do it instead of me.
Well, and to do this with a full crowd of audience, it's so unusual, so out of practice, the situation for so many years. But thank you. And I think, Kathy, you've given an excellent talk, a very personal reflection, but something that certainly I can fully empathize with and sympathize with. I think as women leaders, you utilize the full set of your experience and skills, whether that comes from you being a woman. I mean, you make the best of all the leverage that you have. So I think, yes, a part of my leadership as foreign minister in the ministry, the 38th and the first foreign minister, a woman. And I think part of my leadership was different because I was a woman, unlike the 37 men who went before me. And you make the best of it, right? And yes, there are some situations where you are in a very key decision-making context, such as the National Security Council, where I was the one and the only woman throughout my period, and it was not my choice to bring in a second woman to that setting anyway. But you also then use whatever leverage you have in personal decision-making power to promote other women, and I certainly try to do that, to place qualified women in key ambassadorial positions, key headquarters, senior management positions, and I think you know, the hard work and the legacy, some of it lives on, some of it is built upon by your successor, by the younger women coming up. And yes, the foreign ministry is more than half women now. And so you see the ranks, you know, they're coming up at the director level, at the director general's level. Unfortunately, when I left the foreign ministry and took my final photo with the senior staff, I looked at the photo later and they were still all men, you know, in the most higher ranks, still men. But that since has also changed. Now there is a woman among the deputy ministerial post. There are now several women in director general position. So part of it is a natural evolution of the social change, whereby women are entering professional schools in majority, law schools, medical schools, departments of foreign policy, and so on and so forth. So it's a natural progression, but it certainly helps to have leadership that encourages that and promotes that. I got my position only because the president wanted me in that position, despite the fact that I was not a homegrown ministry professional, despite the fact that I was a woman. He wanted 30% women in his first cabinet, and I was one of them. So it requires that extra push at the highest level. It requires then, you know, system change to sustain that. And I think we made some of that system change, some of that culture change, some of that changes in the working habits and the culture in the ministry. I'm sure there have been some backlash as well as some backstepping, but I do believe that the forward progress of, you know, genuine gender equality in the foreign ministry and government bureaucracy, civil service as a whole is a movement forward, sometimes at a quicker pace. What is the problem with Korea is the private sector. One of the, you know, lowest ranking when it comes to women's economic participation, especially at the managerial level in the so-called the large corporations. And you can't, you know, governments you can do with the leadership and push, but to bring about real change in the private sector, the corporate sector, it's a tougher challenge, because I think the immediate, you know, bottom line of where is their profit, you know, and where is the most effective placement of your human resources to create that profit margin. And I mean, they go to the immediate pool of talent, which is already men-filled. So it's difficult to bring about that change. But some have brought about that change with legal change, such as in Norway. They make it a law for 30% women in boards, for example. And that has really made a big push for women's participation in the corporate sector. I don't know if that's possible given the current political non-productivity, if I may put it that way. And as you say, given that gender backlash that we were seeing, some of that backlash is, of course, natural to any change. There are about to be some backlash, but I think the vociferousness and the tenaciousness, of course, this is also fueled by the space that is opened in the social media. It requires that political will on the part of those who are in positions of decision making and change to give us that extra push.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. I think she makes a very important point. But, that is also, I mean, do you think in terms of whether it's the government, whether it's in implying quotas, whether it's putting into regulations, what is the government's role in ensuring that there is a certain amount of equality in society between genders, of course, but well, mainly gender?
Well, I do think the government and the legislators have a role in terms of legislation to outlaw discrimination on the basis of gender, and I think we all have that. Again, the U.S. just never passed the Equal Rights Amendment of the Constitution, but we have a lot of legislation. Korea has a lot, so I think that's an important role to pass that legislation. I think it's an important role of the courts to consider cases and people to be able to bring cases when that's in question. But I think beyond that, and again, it's an area where there can be clearly a range of political debate about it, is to try to address some of the underlying issues that constrain women from being able to fully participate. And again, I mentioned someone which I think, again, on the books, Korea has done quite well, and that's in parental leave and in childcare. But even something like parental leave, there has to be the societal and the kind of cultural change that says, okay, the government is giving us parental leave, in fact, requiring that our companies pay for it, but I'm not going to take it because it's going to, it's going to damage my career prospects. So I think clearly there's an important role for government, but but it sort of is not enough either. There has to be a lot of, as you suggest, leadership in the private sector. And cultural change in terms of expectations that people have about how they can have the lives they want to have. That's
true. I'm going to go back to our audience and see if there's a question that someone would like to. I see a lot of hands. I'm going to maybe get like 2 questions. Let's see, 2 questions, one from here and one from there, and then answer both at once. Yes.
Thank you so much for your speech. My name is Sakshi. I'm an undergraduate student here at IWA. So you mentioned that we need to address issues of inequality. And the way I see that happening is through a transfer of power. But to the extent of my knowledge, it's that very transfer of power that brings about a resistance towards change. So my question is, how do we tackle inequality while managing the disruption of the traditional balance of power that is necessary to actually bring about any kind of change for gender equality?
Balance of power between men and women, I'm thinking. On this side, I'm going to leave it to you.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Maya. This is my first semester at IWA GSIS. So, Ambassador, you mentioned that you worked in other countries before working here in Korea. My question is, do you have any experience related to gender equality or maybe inequality that you got here in Korea but you did not find it in any other countries? Thank you.
I think maybe one more question. I know there are a lot of hands, but I have like you've been keeping your hand up in the air for a while, so.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Marzayem, and this is also my first year in GSIS. I study development cooperation. I was always admired women leaders, and my question is, in what ways your position affect the gender equality in foreign policy?
Sorry,
in foreign countries.
in foreign countries?
Foreign policy.
Mhm.
Oh, okay. Foreign policy.
Right. Well, first of all, thank you for all those questions. I have to try to be brief because they're all very complex questions and good questions. I mean, with respect, if you mean gender inequality, I guess I have a fairly straightforward, as I kind of mentioned earlier, I think that governments and have a responsibility, and including international responsibilities, to ensure that they have legislation and implementing legislation that addresses questions of inequality, and I mean some are easier to address than others. I was also referring to, I mean, what I see as a source of some tension here in South Korea and also in the United States, and that is, within our countries, the greater sense of economic inequality and lessening opportunities. Because I think when you get into a situation where the younger generation feels like the system overall, I mean, is not working for any of them in terms of upward mobility, and that then it increases the sense of competition, and there's a greater sort of, I think, inclination just to either kind of scapegoat it, and sometimes in the United States the scapegoats are immigrants. I mean, it can be women too, it can be a lot of different people, but that is part of the gender equation too. And having women and men thinking about that together is essential to us. That's my own view. In terms of other countries, yeah, I mean, first of all, I guess in my career, I'm thinking of China, Northern Ireland, and different places where I served. Oftentimes, I was the first woman to be, it's not just in those jobs, it wasn't kind of just in Korea. And so, there was often kind of a dynamic around that, even if they were relatively junior jobs. But for example, in Northern Ireland, which was still in conflict, and we were having, kind of negotiations about it, the US was very deeply involved. I was the first person to lead this very tiny consulate there. And again, that's a job that a lot of men didn't think led to kind of a traditional pattern of why not be an ambassador, but it was an incredibly influential job because it was kind of a hearts and minds job. And actually, while I was there and while we were engaged in these negotiations, the senior British official there was a woman. She was nominated, she's the first woman to be in that job. She was the secretary for Northern Ireland, a brash British politician from a working class district named Mo Molan. And she really shook things up. I mean, Northern Ireland was a very conservative society in every way, across in terms of women's participation and so on. And I mean, it's just as simple as saying, I think that she was so unconventional. I mean, she's much more unconventional. She's a politician, and I was unconventional just because I was there. I think it did kind of help. And I'm not saying it was because of us being there, but one other thing that happened in Northern Ireland is there was, without getting too much in the weeds on this, there was kind of an election among the parties there. It's a very small place. And there was a new party called the Women's Coalition. It was actually a group of women, and they actually won a couple of seats, which won them a table at the negotiations, and they ended up playing a very pivotal role as kind of mediating among the various sides. They weren't the power players, they never took power, but they played a really kind of decisive role. So there was this dynamic that developed. Now, would it have developed if Mo Molan hadn't been there and I hadn't been there? Yeah, probably, I don't know. But it was an important, I think, maybe thing to kind of observe. And again, I mean, known by people who follow the Northern Ireland peace process, but maybe kind of an interesting case study or example. I mean, actually, in China, when we opened our post there, it was a very small post, and it grew, and I was the first woman assigned there. And this is the first time we'd had American diplomats in China, right? And I was in Guangzhou, not in Beijing. And the Chinese employees there were just intrigued. Yeah, I mean, it's just like, it was like, wow, they'd only met American men. Now here's an American woman, and so it it just opened up, I had more conversations with people, including our women's staff, about the one-child policy, which was a painful policy for them, about lots of things. So that was, I would say, in the Balkans where I worked, again, at a time of conflict and war. Sometimes, again, just being a woman made you had a more natural entree into some of the civic groups and others who were very involved but didn't have a place oftentimes at the political table or at the negotiating table. But, and certainly the embassy, if it was a good embassy with a good, good leadership, they would know it was important. But I think having women to deploy, and especially women if they knew the language or something, kind of helped us to cover those things better and maybe even to encourage them a bit, So I hope that was helpful. What was the last question? I'm sorry, I can't read my own writing now.
Policy implications.
Oh yeah, policy and so on. Well, I could take that a number of different angles, but actually, maybe I'll just mention this. I actually only discovered recently by using my favorite research tool, Google, that there's something called a feminist foreign policy. And yeah, I'm sure Foreign Minister Kang knows well about it. And I began to read, and again, use Google too, you can see, a lot of really interesting commentary about what would a feminist foreign policy look like. And I just found it very stimulating. And I have to say, I'm still kind of processing that because I said it earlier, and maybe I'm being too traditional and showing my generation here. I always find it a little bit too easy to say, well, if we're all good feminists and we get a lot of women, we're going to solve all the problems. I don't think they're that easy to solve, But I do think that looking at issues, including foreign policy issues, through the lens of gender, brings us a lot of perspectives, which I realize are absolutely essential. So getting back to your question, I think maybe we should have thought more consciously, more rigorously about that earlier. And not just we, you and I, now this is very female of us, we're personally responsible. We failed, I failed. But just as a whole, this is a very kind of exciting and important area, I think, for those of you, and I know there are many who are looking at international relations and looking at foreign policy. And certainly it's related to the issues of women's equality and opportunity in their home countries, but it's also related to, right, how do you develop broader policies, whether it's through multilateral organizations or in your bilateral relationships that are going to be more effective?
I think Sweden is representative of the feminists, and it is a focus on the most vulnerable factors of most societies, and therefore, if you focus on empowering and trying to resolve some of the issues in this area, then you, by such efforts, resolve a lot of other issues of that society, and it benefits the whole society as a whole.
And if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to add one thing, because I haven't mentioned it yet, but I feel like I should here, and I talked to President Kim about it as well. But I came to IHWA while I was ambassador a number of times, happily, and perhaps most memorably in 2009, when then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton made her first overseas trip, and came and gave a talk. It was billed as a town hall at IHWA, and that really was the beginning of her as Secretary of State saying, she didn't use the words feminist foreign policy, maybe that would have been too much for people in the United States, I don't know, but she said, she put women's issues and women's equality at the center of our foreign policy, and rhetorically, which is important from a Secretary of State, nominated Ambassador at Large to be Ambassador for Women's Affairs, and that has continued, but really deepened, I think, now with this notion of, where does that take you? But always remember, and some of you may have been here for it, when she spoke to that group, it was just an incredible occasion. The students were amazing.
It was. I think we've gone past our time, but thank you for being here. I know when you served as ambassador in Korea, it wasn't an easy time between the U.S. and Korea. But as President Kim mentioned, your attention to the everyday Korean, your love for the biking, your love for playing tennis, your love that shone through for the Korean people as a whole, which showed, in Ms. Shimun Young with your Korean language, really it touched us in a way. And I think for us, because you were such an effective diplomat in that way, but also you are a woman. So that pushed the needle forward for a lot of us, and I think that will benefit not just us here, but I think for all of our students, wherever they may be. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you all for being here as well, and have a great day.